Hello and welcome back to So You Got a Life Sci Degree. We're your hosts, Lisa and Farida, two life sci undergrad students trying to navigate our future careers. This is episode 6. We're switching it up a bit this week and talking about the case against a PhD. How are you doing, Farida?
I'm kind of drowning in work this week.
Sad.
Yeah, a little bit. Besides that, I'm doing pretty good. I think I've spent all my free time watching Mark Rober's YouTube videos, which has been a highlight. So yeah, that's been really great. We both watched the squirrel obstacle course video, which was amazing.
Yeah, it's essentially this video where this YouTuber named Mark Rober, he constructs this whole obstacle course to see if squirrels can solve it in order to get a huge nut prize from this bird feeder, and would definitely recommend.
Yeah, I feel like his videos are so wholesome, but also just like make me so excited to do things in the world, like just explore for the sake of exploring. I don't know.
That's sweet. That's sweet.
Yeah, they're very inspirational. How's your week been?
It's good. I have some exciting news. So, as the listeners might know, I have fibromyalgia/RSI in my hands, and so typing can be painful for me. I usually use dictation when I type, but I found out a few months ago about this thing called laser projection keyboards, and you and I have talked about this before.
Yeah, I am so excited about this. It is so cool.
It is really cool. It's actually cooler than I thought it was once I opened the manual and found out how it actually works. So picture something that is about the size.
Basically, just picture the future.
Yeah, like picture the future, but it's about the size of a Rubik's Cube, but more rectangular. And there's this slit at the top that lets out this projection keyboard, and it's red. So it's like a laser, and it projects a keyboard onto your desk. It's smaller than a regular keyboard, but not extremely tiny. And then at the bottom, there's this other slot that lets out infrared light. And then there's another sensor. I don't remember if it's at the bottom or the top, but it senses where your fingers move according to how it affects the bouncing or detection of infrared light. I'm not entirely sure, but it's super cool.
Mm-hmm.
You can hook it up to your laptop using Bluetooth or using a wired connection. And it's quite glitchy and it's a little slow. And it seems to prefer when you use chicken typing. Which super aggravates me because I hate chicken typing.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, yeah, and I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what kinds of things I can do with it. I think one of the applications is I'll be able to play those computer games where you need to use the arrow keys, because that's one thing that works really well. So
Nice.
Not super relevant to being in school, but yeah.
Yeah, basically looks like any sci-fi movie where there's like hologram projections. That's like what this keyboard is basically.
Yeah, it's like any sci-fi movie, except if the main character was actually using this, the ship would crash into the next planet because it's not accurate. So there's work to be done, but yeah. I'm happy this exists.
Nice.
So like I mentioned before, we're doing something a little different today. Instead of having a guest on, our own lovely Farida is going to present her case against getting a PhD.
I am. But before we get into that, a note that this episode was recorded a couple months ago, back when we hadn't become the fantastic, established, professional co-hosts that we are today. You might notice a difference in the audio quality as well as in the coherency of our speech patterns.
It's like weird to say like the case against doing a PhD, because obviously if you want to be like a professor, you know, like at a university, you have to do a PhD, or like,
yeah,
you know, certain types of research, like cancer research, you might need one. But I guess this is for like the ambiguous cases.
You'll learn this all in my framework.
Oh, all in your framework.
Yeah,
Okay. You got me. Okay. All right, Farida, what is the first reason?
Okay, I don't know how you want to structure this, because I do have like I have a 3-pronged argument, or case rather, but we could talk about like the context in which you might want to consider not getting one. Do you think we should start with that, just so it's like a more convincing case maybe?
Yeah, you can start with that. Like what kinds of like cases are you thinking of applying this to?
Yeah, so the way you should think about doing a PhD, and not just PhDs but grad school in general, is like if you have a specific job that you're interested in that is like pretty viable for you to get, that requires this degree, then you should get the degree. But if you're kind of like not really sure what I'm doing, maybe I should just up my skills, like kind of need more time. Any like kind of more ambiguous case, you should not get a PhD or a grad degree until you have like a very specific role that you like think it's necessary for. I can explain that a little bit more later. But yeah, that's kind of like how you should think about it. So in your case, like if you're thinking about, I know you're interested in like some cancer research roles or being a prof. The thing with being a prof is a little tricky because it's very much not a viable option for majority of people out there. Yeah, but let's talk about like your cancer research roles. That might be something specific that is a viable option for you and requires a PhD. And in that case, like, yeah, you might actually want to go for it. But yeah, this will kind of be, hopefully by the end of the episode, it'll be like a little more clear. Any questions there?
Do you also want to explain why you know so much about the case against doing a PhD?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I could need to give some background now.
Story time.
Depending on when this like episode comes out, like listeners might already know this. Also, if our listeners are majority friends and family, they might already know this. But basically, my undergrad is in biology. I thought I was going to go the academic research route. And then at some point, I was kind of like, okay, becoming a prof in like the life sciences is pretty close to impossible, and definitely impossible with like kind of the credentials I have so far, I feel like. So yeah, now I'm kind of planning to do my master's in econ and kind of go that route. I'm still not sure if I want to go the academic route or not because it is a lot more viable in econ. But yeah, I just don't know. So basically, all of this came out from me like doing all that research, kind of getting my like career heart broken.
But wait, didn't you also like present this to your parents?
Oh yeah. So I didn't actually present this to my parents, but yeah, I basically had to tell them at some point over the summer that I was going to do econ and not biology anymore.
Yeah.
So during that time, I was outlining a presentation and then like outlined this whole thing to just clarify.
Did you end up actually making the PowerPoint?
Well, I made like a version 1, but like I didn't finish it. Yeah, but then when I told them, I just didn't use the PowerPoint. I just kind of
right. Because like using a PowerPoint is really like ridiculous. And, like,
that's not why. It's just like wasn't fitting for the moment.
All right. Do you want to get into your 3-pronged fork?
Yeah.
Farida, what is the first reason why you should not do a PhD if you are in a situation where it is seemingly ambiguous?
Yeah, so the first reason, well, okay, even if you are, sorry to like not actually get into it, but even if you are like have a specific point in mind, you should still, listen and see if this applies to you or not. But anyway, the first reason, so this is roughly in order of least to most convincing. So the first reason is the opportunity cost, or why a PhD is not actually free. This is the most common argument and probably the one that you've heard already if you've like kind of done any research on this. Yeah, so this applies to pretty much every industry. So when I talk about a PhD, I'm not necessarily talking specifically about life science. That is what I know the most, so I will try to talk about that a little within each point. So pretty much whatever degree you have, like instead of getting a PhD, you can probably also make a crap ton of money like outside of that role. And yeah, so sometimes it's just not worth it, like both in terms of money, but also in terms of like peace of mind and contribution to society and years that you could be starting a family and enjoying your life. Yeah, to give some specifics in terms of industries and degrees. So in the life sciences, you could be going into roles that are like pharma, or we talked about with Kara, like the M-Biotech program at U of T. There's more and more master's programs like that are coming out to cater towards like industry roles that still have a lot of impact, and you get to do really cool stuff, and you probably also make more money. Yeah, so there's stuff like that. And then any role that's very quant focused, so like math or physics or those kind of roles, they still have the same thing in life science where they're like really infatuated with like the academic route. But if you have good quant skills, like there is so many jobs that will pay you so much money because those skills are so in demand. So yeah, you basically like the opportunity cost is really high there, just because like you could be making so much money. And also with tech, like there's so many cool things you could be working on, even in like nonprofit sectors if that's something you're interested in. And then with anyone who has like a humanities or arts degree, it's the same thing. You might not necessarily get to work in like something that's directly related, but you can bring those aspects of your degree to a lot of different jobs. And I've heard of a lot of people, especially like poli-sci majors, who've worked in like kind of tech industry now, mostly because a lot of those like skills are not too hard to like actually pick up just based on free or cheap like internet learning. And that's actually really like, it's still seen as pretty credible in the tech industry as long as you've got some projects going, you can show your skills. And if you have a degree that's in an arts background, they'll actually appreciate that more because you can kind of bring your knowledge of like, okay, this is where you're going to learn that I have no idea what happens in an arts degree. But if you're like a communications major, or you have like some, you know, like
writing skills, or
writing skills, even just like political knowledge, like tech is more like tools that can be applied to different contexts. So if you have understanding of those contexts, you're already have like a bit of an upper hand there, that things that like people in life sciences maybe, or people with more quant heavy skills don't understand. So they really need those like arts majors to, you know, support them in understanding those kind of contexts and what's going on there. Yeah, so the opportunity cost is also particularly high with any industry that requires running experiments, or let's say field instead of industry. So this could be like physics, or it could be life science, because you don't really have the option of, okay, ending my workday at 5 and then going home and hanging out with my family. It's very much based on when your experiments are on, when your animal's feeding schedule is like, it just takes a lot of time to do your research. Whereas like for example in econ, like you can just run your analyses, and then if need be you can let it run overnight and just come home and like work on it in the morning, right? So yeah, that's like the opportunity cost argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is also like the most intuitive. Like I've definitely thought about this. Like I think anyone who's like, oh, I'm gonna be like doing it until I'm like 35, like it's just you're obviously, your brain just goes like, ew. Probably like slightly less intuitive, but like I didn't have to like Google this to like think about it. Where it's like when you're doing your PhD, like you get a stipend, but you're not really like making money. You just kind of like break even, just like try to get by without accumulating debt, kind of thing. Yeah, so it's like sure you can like make more afterwards, but I guess like for that time period, you're not like, you know, you're not actually like generating income. But like it is also something to consider that like if getting a PhD is going to get you positions with like higher salary, like in the long term it probably pays more. Like in my case, if I want to do cancer research, if you need like a PhD to get kind of like a lead researcher role like at a, you know, like company or whatever, then like for me, I think in the long term like it results in more income, which is like is a whole other thing, because then for people who can't afford to do a PhD, then it's like, you know, that's like a whole other thing.
It is a whole other thing in terms of like the high bar to jump over. But that actually leads perfectly into our second argument.
Our second argument?
Okay, my second argument.
What is our second argument, Farida?
Okay, so I'll state it and then I'll like explain why it's connected to what you're talking about. So the second argument is a PhD is training for a research-intensive academic position, and the chances of you getting such a position are practically non-existent. So point I'm kind of trying to make here is that you have to be realistic about like if you're actually going to get the position that you're training for. And so this argument of like, oh yeah, but when I get this position, I'm going to make a whole lot of money and therefore it offsets the opportunity cost, is related to this question of can you actually get the position though, right? Which I'm arguing for academic positions is like not true. Most people who get PhDs are not going to be getting those positions, and therefore that they don't actually offset the opportunity cost. This might be different in terms of like, yeah, if you're saying like the cancer research role in some industries like higher up, yeah, that might be worth it. It might be totally something you can get, and therefore like offsets the financial opportunity cost. Yeah, so how likely it is that you're going to get an academic position varies like pretty greatly between fields, but generally the chances are pretty low everywhere. Okay, wait, before I do this, to go back a step, is that obvious to you that a PhD is training for a research intensive academic position?
I think so. Like it took me a surprising, like I don't think I fully internalized that until like actually a few weeks ago, but yeah, that makes sense. Like traditionally PhDs have been for like you're training to be like a prof, you're training to do research, but like lately there have been like industry jobs that ask for PhDs. So
yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary. I think also 2 extra mini points on that is that a big reason that it's training for an academic position is because the people training you, i.e. like your supervisor, your prof, doesn't actually know usually anything outside of that. They've dealt with academia their whole like career life, so that's what they're going to train you for. And then the other thing is the research intensive part. So yeah, there are different types of academic positions with varying degrees of teaching and research responsibilities. So like the cream of the crop is research intensive. This is like what your profs, your supervisor does, because if it's research intensive, they can hire PhD students. So back to the actual point. Yeah, so I was just saying that this, varies greatly between fields, still pretty low chances everywhere. In life sciences, there are notably very few open academic opportunities. I don't exactly know why this is. There are like probably a whole host of things mixing together. With life sciences, you do usually have to set up an actual lab, buy lab equipment, and get lots of funding. So this is pretty heavily dependent on the funds that are available to you, available to the school you're at.
Yeah. And wait, and like, so like how you found out that life sci is like perhaps comparatively worse than other fields is like just through like asking people or like through Googling?
Yeah,
or-
so some of it is Googling, some of it is asking people. A lot of what made me rethink pursuing grad school and like all this stuff is that some of the people who graduated in programs that I was initially interested in. So for background, like I was interested in doing a master's and then PhD in neuroscience and then trying for research-based positions related to that. But a lot of people who I talked to who are alumni from McGill, like from the PhD in neuroscience program, a lot of them were not working in positions that were related to even their interests like as researchers or even in research roles. So yeah, lots of like asking people, especially asking people from programs that you're considering. Yeah, and also like I think like McGill is pretty top notch when it comes to like life sci in general in Canada at least. So like hearing that from people who are like pretty cream of the crop in Canada, it's like pretty rough.
Right. So like TLDR, there's like more people who want professor positions than there are positions available, especially for life sci research. And even if you get it, there are even less research intensive positions than there are like more like teaching based positions, especially now that universities are starting to like split up teaching and research duties.
Yeah, that's like a perfect summary. Yeah, so what that leads to is a lot of people who now stick it out until like well into their mid 40s if they're like searching for academic positions. This usually takes the form of multiple postdocs where you're still not paid a lot of money.
That's whack.
It really is, yeah.
I don't get what a postdoc is. Like, to be honest, like I pretend to understand what it is, but it's just like after you do a PhD, you need to do like cheap labor before you can.
So a postdoc didn't used to be required, and indeed in a lot of like fields that are not life science, it's still not the norm. The reason that it is the norm in life science is because there's so little opportunity.
Yeah. I think like the thing that confuses me is like why is it called a postdoc? Like why isn't it just called a job? You know what I mean?
It's just like really an excuse to not pay you enough for a job. Because if you are giving a job to someone who has a PhD, you need to pay them like they got a PhD. But a postdoc does not pay you like you have a PhD.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like pretty much the standard now. Like you pretty much have to do at least one postdoc. Now it's becoming like multiple postdocs, but that's a really long time to not get paid like a normal amount.
Yeah. Like people are always like, oh, like med school is such like a long track. I mean, there is also like the fees. Like it is more expensive and you don't get paid to do it. But like still, it's like you at least you're like working and making money after you're done, you know?
Yeah.
I was gonna say, do you want to give the last little golden nugget about the dropout rates?
Yeah, so I found this in a book, so this is like more legit than some of my other.
Oh, I see. That's reassuring.
Yeah, I mean, not that it's more legit, it's just like this number does not come from thin air. But yeah, the PhD dropout rate for most programs is around 50%, so like that's rough.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully a lot of that is like within the first year.
Yeah, I don't actually know when it is, so I can't tell you that. I'm hoping it's from like before. So if you don't know in your PhD, like you have to do this huge test in the middle, like your qualifying exams. And I'm hoping it's like before that exam because after that exam, you're kind of chilling a lot more. But before that exam, I'm pretty sure it's like pretty rough. So it's probably from that. There's usually not too much of a consolation prize either, right? Like, what are you going to do with an almost done PhD? Like, it doesn't actually give you the leg up that a PhD does, like completing a PhD does. The other thing is like, there's lots of reason that people drop out. Like, your first instinct might be to like, oh, they're not tough enough, like they didn't finish their PhD or whatever. But there's so much outside of your control with the PhD. Yeah. Like you're so dependent on funding.
Also, kind of on a related note, I don't know if you remember, but like a couple years back, I went to this science event and I met like this one like random dude who was running it, and then he like let me like do like a brief tour of their lab at McMaster. Like he was like a PhD student or a postdoc or something like that. He was like talking with another one of the lab people, and they were talking about like this guy who he's like still not like finished his PhD, and he's been doing it for like 8 years.
Yeah.
They talked about how like sometimes like supervisors like they'll like draw it out on purpose.
Yeah, because I mean we'll talk about this more later, but there's a reason that they draw it out as a little teaser.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that. There's also like we actually both talked to like my high school mentor who was doing her PhD at the time that she was like mentoring me for a semester in high school. She had the unfortunate like circumstance of her supervisor switching institutions during her PhD.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah, like that's just terrible. Like your supervisor is just like, okay, bye. Like, what are you gonna do? So that's rough. Yeah, so there's just like so much outside of your control. Not to like mention also like family things if you're like any other personal type of thing. Okay, so moving on to the third argument. This for me was the most convincing because it actually made me like take a step back and be like, whoa, is it actually worth it to get a PhD? Because yeah, the last argument is that you become a less desirable hire after getting your PhD outside of academia in most cases.
You say this is like your most convincing for you, but it is also the hardest to prove.
Yeah. I think this argument emphasizes the point of like you need to talk to people who are in your field, in your industry, and like a few years ahead of you because this is way more field specific than the other points. So specifically in econ, like I was talking to a family friend who was kind of giving me some candid information, and she was saying that like the position that she's in now as an economist for the government of Canada, so this is free like information that's freely available on the government of Canada website if you do some digging. They have like different classifications and different rankings within those classifications. So I think for economists in that like group of positions, it's like EC is the code for it. And if you have a master's degree, you basically start at, don't quote me on these numbers, but you can just search them up yourself, at EC03, and then you can work up to EC07, which is like kind of the upper limit for that. And then if you have a PhD, you necessarily have to start at EC05 because your qualifications are more. And so each of those numbers has like a pay structure associated with it. So you have like a specific pay at EC03 and a specific pay at EC05.
Right.
And with a PhD, you work also up to EC07. So you can start with a master's degree and still end up in the same place as someone who got a PhD. But it costs less to hire you. And also she was saying that now that she's like at a position that she would have gotten with a PhD, it took her 3 or 4 years. I can't remember exactly. But if she'd gotten her PhD, it would have actually taken longer to do that PhD and then get this job. So it's like not even worth it in the first place.
Yeah. But like so like the question that pops into my head though, like just like logically, is that if I'm like a company and I want to get the best candidate, like maybe if I'm really scrapping for money, then I'll sacrifice for like a less qualified candidate, like someone with a master's, and then I will like train them like up myself. But if I'm a company who has the money to hire people, why would I opt for the less qualified candidate? Because yes, you have to pay them more, but they are also more qualified.
Right. But what if a lot of the master students can show that they're reasonably as qualified on these specific skills, right? Because with the PhD, if you're trying to go into something that's not academia, your main argument is that I have transfer skills. My skills apply to your industry in your like line of work. But if this transfer isn't 100% or you're not working specifically in a research position and you were trained for a research position, then your skills are still a little bit offset with what that industry is looking for, right?
Okay.
So in that case, the master student might be just as qualified. They can be like, hey, look at these side projects I did, or look at this work I did during my master's that's like very much aligned with what your industry does. And like this PhD student or this PhD like graduate doesn't actually have that much more to offer, and you're paying them more during training, right?
Okay, right.
I do understand that like in anything that's not as clear cut as like the econ example, it's a little bit harder. Also with the econ example, if you decide to go for like academia, you still can't do that without a PhD. So yeah, the general advice here is that in any position where the educational requirements are PhD or something else, the hiring unit will probably prefer the something else, assuming that they're reasonably qualified. So you should do the something else and do it well.
I think the mistake there is like don't get a PhD if you're trying later on to get a job that a PhD is not necessarily required for.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So that's a good point. So I think that is like what I'm talking about. But the argument I guess that precedes that is that you will most likely be in that position of trying to get a job that PhD is not required for, just by nature of how many opportunities are actually available.
Okay, so you're saying you're like screwing yourself over because
yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Farida, now that you have given us your three-pronged fork, why is it the case that if these three very compelling reasons that were thought up by a mere undergrad student who's trying to figure out her life, why isn't this talked about more often?
Yeah, so a big part of this, particularly in the life sciences, is that PhDs are basically cheap labor for professors to conduct research. And the same thing with undergraduates, actually.
like at McGill, we get a lot of almost like propaganda that's like, we're an R1 university, research is our thing, like you got to do research in your undergrad degree. There's so many ways to do research. Are you doing research? You better be doing research. And part of this is just like institutions like McGill make money from research output. Like that is their primary currency. So they need undergrad students and they need grad students to kind of do a lot of that legwork. So that's a big reason that this case against a PhD isn't talked about more often.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I totally get that with like the postdoc thing. Yeah, my brain just doesn't comprehend what a postdoc is. I guess because the whole concept shouldn't exist in the first place.
Yeah, it's kind of like this made up role. Okay, now I feel like we're getting into like how to evaluate whether you should get a PhD or not. So yeah, like we said before, first and foremost, you should only consider pursuing a PhD if you have a specific job in mind that absolutely requires a PhD. And we kind of hinted at this earlier in the episode, but do not pursue a PhD to quote unquote buy time.
That one I feel really deeply.
Yeah.
When people are like, oh, I don't really know what to do, so I'm just going to go to grad school, like that is something I think I personally like am very conscientious to not do, which is like why I want to take a year off undergrad to like work and just see what it's like.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like I don't understand because it's like if you just work, even if like I work as a lab tech, I know I'm not making much, you know, like maybe 30 grand, like at most 40 grand a year, but like at least I'm not losing money.
Yeah.
And it's like it's not like you don't gain anything from working.
Yeah, 100%. Also, like with tech, there's like so many things you can just do. Like you can make so much money just sitting in your like house. There's like this podcast that I've listened to a few episodes of. It's called Indie Hackers. And it's just people who like have these like businesses basically, and some of them make a lot of money and like haven't like they basically just learned tech skills. So yeah, lots of cool inspiration on there if you're looking for anything. Yeah, so one thing that I found helpful for me is to make a litmus test. Kind of how this came about is that I'm still very much infatuated with trying to do the academic route. I haven't failed hard enough in econ, to be very candid, for it to be inconceivable for me to do that. But I also don't want to fall into this trap of like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get my PhD, blah, 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 right? So the idea to do a litmus test is basically to have a handful of kind of checkboxes that you need to be able to check them off before accepting a PhD position. And what this criteria is can be very personal, and you need to come up with it based on like what you value and what's important to you. So it can be drastically different, and also it's dependent on what field and industry you're in, right? And the earlier you make this list, probably the more objective view you have of how well your chances are in this career, just because like you're not going to be enamored by, oh yeah, even though like I haven't done so well in this place, like I can still make a comeback, like blah, blah, right? So the earlier in your career you do this, the better.
Right.
And I think like this idea is still pretty vague right now, so I'm gonna kind of give my own checklist as like an example, and then we can talk about that. So for me, one thing is that if I do a PhD program, it has to be a top 25 program. Top 25 in terms of ranking of department / program / university in world rankings. And that's a little bit harsh. And the reason being is that, again, very few academic positions and almost all of them are from like top 6 institutions, right? And this number, like top 25, for example, is going to vary between fields.
Yeah. And also like depending on which rating system you're using.
Yeah. So that's the tricky part, is that not all rating systems are the same. So there's a little bit of ambiguity for sure. But I think that's more of a minor problem than figuring out this number for your field.
And to be clear, like top 25 is like top 25 in the world.
Yeah, in the world.
Like, are you willing to travel to like Australia?
I feel like I am.
Yeah. The further away from me, the better.
Yeah, so it's different for different fields for sure. So in econ, there's still a lot of opportunity, therefore I'm willing to go to 25, but for other industries, you might have to really lower that number. Again, it's like harsh criteria, but you need to be able to check that off to like have a more objective measure. The second thing is to have one article published before getting into my PhD. This might not be on everyone's list, but for like the life sciences, I feel like this is becoming more and more common. And indeed, people who get actual academic positions, like this is almost becoming standard.
Yeah, like you're saying for the people who actually succeed at getting like tenure track positions, before they get into their PhD, they've already had articles published in journals.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I see. Oh, I guess that kind of makes sense. So like my question though is like, if you haven't even done your PhD though, in what context are you publishing that article? Like, is it during your master's?
Great question. So there's a few different ways that this can take. So one thing is that like generally people who are like going to get academic positions have started early, have like done lots of research very early on. So one of my friends who I'm like almost certain is actually very likely to get an academic position is like started publishing in high school. You know, her mom was a prof. She did research for all her high school summers. You know, she really worked on getting published. So she's got lots of papers under her belt now, and she's like the same age as us, which is to say fourth year uni.
Okay.
And I've met some other people on McGill too who are like that, who've gotten like, I told you like this last semester I met someone who had like 6 papers in like frontiers in neuroscience. And again, he's like 1 year older than us. But yeah, even if you're not that insane, like prepared from the beginning, there's still like ways you can do that through maybe your master's is a good opportunity. Also for me specifically, like because I'm coming to econ late, I know that I won't be able to get into a top 25 PhD program without doing some like taking a year or two to just do research at like a research intensive institution.
Like you're saying, like not as part of a master's, like just as part of a job.
Yeah, just
like
as a
research
job.
associate.
Yeah, so they have these programs that are like pre-doctoral programs, and it's essentially just you doing research for like a year or two. But in life science, like you can pretty much just go to any lab and be like, hey, like can you just employ me for like 2 years? And like people in my lab as well when I was doing undergrad research, they were also like, yeah, like we just had like 1 or 2 people who just worked in the lab but weren't necessarily like part of a degree program. Yeah, in life sciences, you can just go to a prof and be like, hey, can I just work for you for a year or two, and I want a publication by the end of this, and they'll be pretty on board because they get like a full-time research technician essentially. So yeah. And then the third thing on my list for me, this is like probably the most personal one and might not apply to your situation whatsoever, but I just want to like show that you can kind of personalize this to like suit your values and things that you want. So for me, I also want to have a certain amount of passive income.
What is passive income, Farida?
I was getting to that. In case you don't know what passive income is, it's just like money that you're not necessarily actively working for. So when you work a job, you get paid maybe like a certain wage, hourly wage, whereas like passive income is like rent money, for example. If you own a property and you get paid rent, it's not like you're actively working for that property. That rent just comes in like month after month.
Or like investment income, I guess.
Yeah, investment income, anything like that. That's passive income. So yeah, this is really important for me because I feel strongly about wanting to support my parents when they're a little bit older. Also, like I know I'm someone who like really wants to just like also enjoy life and not have to like be super worried about money at that age, probably late in my 20s. So I just like having that buffer and not kind of reducing that opportunity cost a little bit. Yeah, any questions about my little checklist? And also like definitely will be revised and like probably changed a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that works, like making a set of criteria and sticking to it. I mean, I suppose like, it's not hard set. Like some of the stuff, if you realize like maybe you set like, I don't know, $5,000 a year as your passive income, but then you realize that actually should be like increased or decreased, like, maybe like a little bit, but try to like stick to it for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to emphasize that like these things are not going to be necessarily easy and they might take a long time to achieve, right? But that's like kind of the point. It's like you want an accurate test. You don't want to be too soft, but again, like yeah, you don't want to be like too rigid. But also this list sounds really easy, like 3 things right now, but it's like it took a lot of research to actually make the list in the first place. So don't like underestimate how much research you're actually gonna have to do to figure out what matters in your field or industry.
Yeah, maybe look at like the resumes or like the LinkedIn history, I don't know, like whatever, of like people who tend to get PhDs or sorry, who tend to get tenure track positions now, and then be like, okay, I should be doing these kinds of things like by this time.
Yeah, that's like amazing strategy, and that's like probably a solid 80% of what I do most of the time. In terms of like figuring out if you're working in industry, yeah, to search up like LinkedIn is a great way to do that. You can also just straight up reach out to people and like ask them what their journey was. But if you're looking for more academic positions, one thing you can do is a lot of PhD programs, they'll, at least in econ, they publish like their recent PhDs and where they got hired. You can go to different departments and see like how many of these PhD graduates are actually getting hired by universities, or what kind of positions do they end up in. Because if you go to that program, then you can assume that you're going to get like a position that's very similar to the ones that current PhD graduates are getting.
That's a very good idea.
Yeah, it's a great resource. You should definitely go check them out. And also if you just look at you recently hired academic staff, you can also see what their qualifications are and what it actually takes. So, yeah, some great methods to go.
Cool.
Yeah, so I have some like just general random other points that don't actually fit into this framework that I want to talk about. So one thing to keep in mind is that a PhD, well, this is not firsthand experience, but doing a PhD is a walk in the park compared to working as a prof. So you should never really have that mindset of like, if I can survive my PhD, things will get easier, because it most certainly will not. It only gets harder from there. So one thing that I've been trying to do in my life right now is not seeing it as like, oh yeah, I'm just going to survive university and then I'll get a real job and life will be easy.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, so like your life right now should be very enjoyable, and like you should be able to create it in a way that like
for sure,
you enjoy the day-to-day and not just like the long-term future.
Like I think one of the things that really kind of like changed my mind, just like thinking about like education in general, is that like try to make it about the journey and not like just like the end point, which like sounds like really cheesy.
It does.
But like don't think like, oh, I'm gonna do my master's and then I'll start like living my life, you know? Like start like now.
Yeah,
because like it is possible.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, there's definitely people who have done their PhD and like love their lives in the meantime. So yeah, you should definitely be one of those people.
And like also just like being a prof is hard. Like there's so many things profs have to do. Like you have to like write grants, you have to like supervise like dozens of students, like undergrads, masters, PhDs, postdocs. You have to like just like running a lab is like running a business. And then you have to grade, you have to like have meetings. Like profs work so many hours a week. So it's like you think they make like 6 figures, but if you actually like look at it like hourly in terms of like how many hours they work, it works out to something like 80K a year. If you compare it to someone who works like like 40 hours a week instead of 60.
Yeah. The other thing, if you are going down this academic path or you are trying to do well in research and stuff like that, do well in your PhD, primary research output is what matters. That's all that matters, really. It trumps everything else in terms of qualifications for an academic position. This really can't be overstated. As a grad student, your primary focus is research. It's not service work. It's not teaching. I think you have to have good teaching reviews, but you shouldn't be spending all your time doing that. Like, research output is what matters. Now, that output might be different in different fields. So in life sciences, this is journal articles. In most fields, it's probably journal articles. In math and comp sci, it's conference papers. In humanities fields, in some of them, it might be books.
You know, humanities people write papers too, right? Like
they write papers too, but their primary currency might be books. Like it might be like they're not evaluated specifically on articles, they're evaluated more on books. Questions, concerns, thoughts?
Being wrong on the internet is my primary concern.
Okay, yeah, I mean, well, that stuff also is from books, so I can just point to my sources and be like, if I'm wrong, then
I got my incorrect knowledge from a source, therefore it is okay.
Well, that's how it works. If the source is incorrect, I can't help it. But yeah, huge caveat, you know, we are people on the internet. This is more, the point of this episode is to put like a questioning seed of doubt in your brain so that you do your
I think that's
research.
what it does. Yeah. Like I think it definitely like opens me to like think a bit more about, like think more concretely about it.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to like actually think, should I do a PhD or not? And just not have just like a blob, like a question mark in your head, but to be able to point out like specific reasons and like avenues of thought. I think that is like useful.
Yeah, that's exactly what I want. I don't want you to be like, oh yeah, based on this like one episode, this is my entire decision. Like do some actual research. So yeah, that's the goal for me here. I was gonna go into like some different resources that I think are great to check out. My like career idol, the person that I get like all my fundamental ideas about how to like navigate careers and stuff like that is just Cal Newport. He's amazing.
Who is Cal Newport? Is he like a YouTuber, writer?
I don't know exactly what his designation is, but he's a professor at Georgetown University in computer science.
Ooh, big boy.
Yeah, he's a big boy. He's also an author, and his books are really good. His early books were on like doing well in high school, doing well in university, good studying habits, but his career books are what I want to recommend here. So Good They Can't Ignore You is a really good one in terms of just like thinking about how you should do well in your career. And then Deep Work is a great one. Those two are like probably pretty fundamental. He has a new one coming out, I think, next year. So pretty excited for that.
And all the resources that we're talking about right now, we're going to link them in the show notes.
Yes. So yeah, definitely go check out his stuff. He's super influential. He also just opened a podcast. Anyway, enough plugging Cal Newport. Another great resource is 80,000 Hours. They have it's a book, but I think they have like a PDF version. And then also they have a good site where you
No, is that thing where it's like to become an expert or something and you do 80,000 hours on it?
No, that's 10,000 hours. That's like the Outliers book and Anders Ericsson, who recently passed away. But anyway, no, 80,000 hours. So their main thing is that if you work full time and work until retirement, you're going to end up working about 80,000 hours over the course of your career, right? That's a lot of your life and a lot of hours. So you should probably put a little bit more thought into it than like, oh yeah, this is probably like what I enjoyed in high school. And so that's their whole spiel. They're also like very much part of the whole effective altruism community. But yeah, they kind of approach career decisions in the similar way that we have now, where it's a little bit more based on frameworks and like more objective lens than I've seen in other career resources.
Yeah.
So I really like that. I think that's a really good resource to check out.
Side caveat, like all this being said, like I don't think everyone needs to derive their primary purpose in life from their job. Like some people do just work to get money and then they have other things that make them happy.
Yeah, that's totally fine. And I actually think you should diversify like your main purposes in life, and doesn't have to be like one thing. But it's still a long time to be working, right? Like you still should put some thought into it.
Yeah. Like you want something that you're at least like neutral about. You don't want to hate your job.
Yeah. So that's kind of their perspective. And I think regardless, they have really good like frameworks for understanding how to make these kinds of decisions. So definitely worth checking out. The book that I was talking about that has a lot of information on the PhD decision is called Good Work If You Can Get It.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember the subtitle, but that's what the main title is, and it's by Jason Brennan.
Cool.
He's a professor as well at Georgetown. Georgetown seems to just like be picking up really great people as professors, apparently. And he's in, I believe, political philosophy or something with like economics, politics, and philosophy. Yeah, and so that's a really great guy. That's where a lot of this information comes from. So that's really worth checking out. And he also goes a lot more into advice of like how to actually do well in your PhD and get an academic job. So yeah, that's a really good one. Check it out as well.
Cool. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, I feel like for me, a lot of the time I think about this stuff, but then I'm just like, yeah, also go with the flow, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely a delicate balance. This is like a point of contention between me and my mom, where she's like, "Oh, you millennials overthink everything." And I'm just like, "No, but we need to. It's the only way we're gonna survive." So yeah.
I mean, I think you also plan your whole life more than most.
Yeah, I kind of talked to you about this before, about like how I'm trying to do more like ABZ planning.
You have names for the ways you plan your life.
No, this is a framework from 80,000 Hours that I think is like super helpful, especially for people like me who are like gonna overthink the next like 15 years of my life. Right? And the primary, like, I've definitely introduced this to you before, but it's basically like having a plan A, a plan B, and then having like a plan for if nothing else works, and just need like a very temporary, okay, I like need some money and just survive, and eventually I'm gonna get back on my feet plan.
That is interesting.
Yeah, so it's like you become more willing to take bigger risks and like kind of go for that A plan because you have like the Z plan to fall back on, and you also have a B plan in case like the A plan doesn't go well. So yeah, that's kind of helpful to like think about. So like the Z plan might literally be like move back in with your parents and like work retail for like a little bit. But just having that backup means like you can really go for it.
All right. Good to wrap up.
Yeah.
This has been another episode of So You Got a Life Sci Degree, about the case against a PhD. We want to give special thanks to our crew of lovely patrons, including our Little Leaf patrons Naeem, Daniil, Shafiq, and Shamima. If you would like to become a supporter of this podcast, you can visit our Patreon at patreon.com/soyougotalifescidegree. The music you're hearing is No Regrets from audiohub.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.